Hi Year 6 and welcome to your next Vikings lesson. Okay, today we're going to look at a little more detail about the Vikings and the first attacks on Britain. Before we start, I want you to think about what have we learned so far. So I've put a few images on the screen for you to have a look at, have a think about what we've learned so far, and then we'll talk through it in a second. So have a think now, pause the video and answer that question. Okay, well done. So what we've talked about so far is we've talked about where the Vikings came from. We've talked about the fact that the Vikings came from Scandinavia, which is Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, that area. We talked about the fact that Vikings were known to come and raid, to steal treasures and jewels, and we also talked about the fact that some Vikings were actually peaceful farmers. So we talked about the fact that Vikings weren't all the same, that there were lots of different Vikings from lots of different places, and they all had slightly different ways of living. Brilliant. So we're going to have a look now at today's lesson, which is looking at where did the first Viking raid take place in Britain. We're going to look at 2 or 3 main sources about the first Viking raid. We're going to look at how reliable these sources are. We're going to think about why we might not trust these sources and why is it difficult to know the full story. Okay, so we all know that Vikings invaded Britain. We also know that some Vikings eventually decided to settle in Britain. But the question is then, where did it all begin? Where does the Viking story start in Britain? So let's have a little look at that now. So before we get started though, we're going to look at the 2 types of sources we have, the historians use. So the first source, and you can pause this quickly if you want to answer this question, and then I'll go for the answer in a second. Okay, so the 2 types of sources, we've got primary and we've got secondary sources. So primary sources are first-hand accounts of what happened. They're written or made at that time in history. Secondary sources are written or made after that time, using primary sources to inform them. So what we tend to find is primary sources are written at that time in history. They might be an eyewitness, it might come from a diary, it might come from a newspaper at the time. Secondary sources might be like history books, or it might be historians' findings, or it might be paintings that were made like several hundred years later. So the question is one better than the other then? Have a think about that. Do you think one type is better than the other? Is primary better than secondary, or is secondary better than primary? So really, neither is better than the other in a lot of the sense that historians use, because we are very limited in what information we have from history, so we have to use what we've got. Now, in terms of reliability, primary sources are more reliable because we can see exactly what they are. We don't have to interpret them ourselves. Secondary sources have been interpreted by somebody else. So in terms of reliability, we'd probably say that primary sources are slightly more reliable than secondary, just because they come from that time period. Secondary sources, if someone's interpreted something incorrectly, as actually did happen with the Vikings, because they found a helmet with 2 horns on its head, and then for a long time in history, historians believed that Vikings used to wear horns on their heads, when actually that wasn't true at all. And so you can kind of see that interpretations of history can be incorrect, and it can give a false perception of it. So in terms of reliability, we prefer primary sources. But as you'll find today, primary sources are really difficult to have for the Vikings because it is so long ago. Okay. So the raid on Lindisfarne then is remembered as one of the first major Viking attacks on Britain and Ireland. The raid, which took place in 793 AD, struck at an isolated yet very significant monastery. An assault on a holy site was unthinkable to Christians. So at that time, it was Anglo-Saxon, and they were Christian at the time in England. And so for them, it was unthinkable. It was a high crime to attack a holy area such as a monastery, and it provoked outrage and fear. So people were very angry at the Vikings, angry that they would attack such a religious area, and also they were fearful because the Vikings had managed to attack this area. They'd not lost any of their own, and they'd managed it with much ease, really. So Lindisfarne was the first of many such raids on a coastal site. As the Vikings grew in confidence and learnt more about the coastline of the British Isles, the raids began to move inland using navigable rivers to take them silently miles inland. So I didn't know if you'd know where Lindisfarne is, which is fine because I didn't know until I was an adult. So I'm going to show you a picture here. So here's a picture of Great Britain. You can see we are down here. This is Sheffield. Now, Lindisfarne is here. It's just off the coast of Northumberland, really northern England. This is this dotted line here is a line between England and Scotland. So it's quite near to the border, and it's just off the coast. And it's a small island called Lindisfarne, sometimes known as Holy Island. And on that island, in fact, there's 2 small little islands, but that's where the monastery was at the time. So you can see where it is in England. I've got another one which is a bit of a close-up picture. So this is Holy Island, and it is separate to the main island. You've got, this is Holy Island here, Lindisfarne Castle. I actually went last year. It's really, really nice. And then you've also got this little part here, which is where the monastery used to be. It's all in ruins now, obviously, because it's several hundred years later. But you can still visit the place if you want to and learn about the history of the Viking attack. Let's move on then. So these are some pictures of Lindisfarne, or Holy Island. And most of the time it's an island. It's just off the coast of Northumberland. But during low tide, you can actually walk or drive across from Lindisfarne to the mainland. So there's a road that gets covered by the sea. But you can still travel across. So I went across to Lindisfarne and we drove across on the road, stayed for a few hours and then went back before the sea came back in and got stuck there. But it's a really, really beautiful place. It's very picturesque. You can see there's lots of, this is a castle. We've got ruins of a church here. And then out here, can you see right in the background, that's where the monastery used to be. Okay, so this is the first source that we've got on the Viking attack. So the Viking raid on Lindisfarne. So I'm going to read it to you. In this year came dreadful forewarnings over the land of Northumbria, terrifying the people most woefully. These were immense sheets of lightning and whirlwinds, and fiery dragons were seen flying through the sky. A great famine soon followed these signs, and not long after, in the same year, on the 6th day before the Ides of January, the harrowing inroads of heathen men destroyed the Church of God in Lindisfarne by robbery and slaughter. And this was written as part of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Now, just a little bit of information for you. So this source is most likely a secondary source written after the attack based on an eyewitness account, but it's the closest we can get to a primary source from that time period. So it's quite likely that whoever wrote that didn't witness the Viking attack on Lindisfarne, because there were, as far as we're aware, no survivors. So it must have come from somebody else. The attack, the source must have come from someone else. An important thing to note is we sometimes say that the attack on Lindisfarne was the first Viking attack, but it wasn't. There may have been some in Kent prior to this, but this was the first one that was actually recorded and written down. So it's the only one that we as historians have as evidence to look at. So if you look at the source here a bit carefully, you can see, let's just have a look at it carefully and I'll just explain what it means. So in this year came dreadful forewarnings. So there's terrible warnings of something bad going to happen. That's what it means. Forewarning means a warning before something. So there's terrible warnings that something was going to happen. It says it terrified the people most woefully. So it terrified the people awfully. Okay, people were really, really, really terrified. There were immense sheets of lightning and whirlwinds and fiery dragons. Okay, seen flying through the sky. So we've got to think now, what do we think immense sheets of lightning and whirlwinds? So it sounds like a storm, doesn't it? There were storms of some sort that went over Lindisfarne that were really terrifying and people were really worried. Whirlwinds, maybe that's some sort of, it wouldn't have been a hurricane, but maybe something similar, like just real gale force winds. Fiery dragons, I'm not sure what that would mean. I don't know if he's meaning that there was if he believed there was genuine dragons. I'm sure he doesn't. Or if it's something different, if it's fiery dragons because of the lightning. I'm not quite sure about that one. And then it says a great famine soon followed these signs. So after the storm, there was a famine. Now, a famine is when you don't have enough food, when the food stops growing. So that might be because of the storm, and maybe it flooded the area, and then none of the food would grow. So they had a famine. That means they didn't have enough food for people to eat. Soon followed these signs, and not long after, in the same year, on the 6th day before the Ides of January, the harrowing inroads of heathen men destroyed the Church of God at Lindisfarne. So the heathen men he's referring to in this, or she, but most likely a he, is referring to in this, is the Vikings. The heathen men are the Vikings by robbery and slaughter. Slaughter means to kill. Okay, so what is the source telling us then? So let's think, what is this source telling us? Well, it's telling us that this year, the year that this happened, some terrible things happened to Lindisfarne. We know that there were terrible storms that happened on the island. So we know there were terrible storms. On the island. We know there was a famine, and then the Vikings attacked. So we can see now that what has sort of happened to Lindisfarne in this year. So this year was just a terrible year for them. Just a lot of terrible things happened, and he's describing it as a sign. Now, a sign is like he's describing it as a sign, as in like a sign from God. So these terrible things happening, the lightning, the famine, it was all a warning of what was going to happen with the Vikings. So he's saying, or he's suggesting, that these were forewarnings. They were warnings of a terrible thing to happen. And the terrible thing, he means the fact that they're destroying the Church of God in Lindisfarne by robbery and sword. That's what he's referring to. So we need to think now, do we think this source is reliable? What do we think? Now, it's reliable in terms of it was written soon after time. It was still written in 793 AD, I think, which is the year of the attack. So it's written in the same year. So it's written in the same year as the attack, which means it was most likely based on real information, most likely based off real first-hand accounts. So that's good. Now, the thing that probably that you might notice, and that I definitely notice, is the thing where it might not be reliable is it saying like fiery dragon. So is it over-exaggerating slightly? We can't tell. So I'm going to write that. We can't tell whether the author has over-exaggerated. Over-exaggerated because fiery dragons doesn't seem that realistic. And also, you might also mention as well, the person wasn't there. It is secondary. So the person might have made a mistake. The person may not have been given the correct information. Like we said, it's the most realistic one we've got. It's the only source we've got that was written in that same time. And person may not have been given the right information. So the next thing it says, what do we think of the source? Now that just depends what you think. Do you think this is a really believable source, or do you think that you don't think this is very trustworthy? Now that's up to you, and when you do your work today, I'd be interested to find out what you think of this source and whether or not you think it is reliable or not. Okay, so this is the second source that we've got here. So this one here, it says this part at the top is not the source, okay? This is just a little bit of a summary of what this is saying. So the Viking attack on the Holy Land of Lindisfarne of the northern coast of Northumbria, early recorded attack. There was situated the monastery of St. Cuthbert, one of the most sacred places of pilgrimage in Britain. That means people used to go there as a religious pilgrimage. They used to go and travel there to go to the monastery of St. Cuthbert. So it was really important for a lot of the religious people in Britain, a lot of the Christians in Britain. So that's important to remember. And it was there that the Lindisfarne Gospels had been copied and illuminated. For more than 150 years, Lindisfarne had been a sanctuary of learning and a repository for riches bequeathed by both the pious and the wicked for the repose of their skulls. So what he's saying here is Lindisfarne was 150 years, they'd kept so many books there. So it was a haven of learning. Loads of people went there to learn about things. There was so many books there, which there wouldn't have been in many places around Britain at that time. So another thing they're saying is that it was really rich. People used to give money to the monastery a lot. So people who were rich would give money to the monastery to sort of make up for all the bad things. So this says like the wicked for the repose of their souls. So it's talking about if you've done bad things in your life, if you made bad choices, and these people wanted to make themselves better, then they could give money to the church, and that would make them, or the monastery, and that would make them feel better, I suppose. So all of it was plundered in the attacks. That means it was all robbed. Everything was taken. Attack on Lindisfarne was unprecedented and horrified those who wrote for it. For Alcuin, who was at the court of Charlemagne and the leader of the Renaissance, it was inconceivable that ships could suddenly appear over the horizon. So he just finds it unbelievable. So Alcuin wasn't there at the time. He wrote this from France, and he wrote it as a letter to the Northumbrian king. So he wrote it to Ethelred, the king of Northumbria at the time. So he said, Lo, it is nearly 350 years that we and our fathers have inhabited this most lovely land, and never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert, splattered with the blood of priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments, a place more venerable than all in Britain, is given as prey to pagan peoples. The pagan, so people who are pagan, it's the people who believe in many gods rather than one god. So Vikings believed in many different gods. If you've like watched Thor and stuff, Thor is based off the pagan religion. So Thor is a person from like paganism. So there's lots of Odin. That's also Loki. They're all pagan gods. Okay, Freya is another one, which is again in like the movie Thor. So it's that's what pagan means. It means believing in many gods. And the Christians looked down on pagans because they would look down on them as not being intelligent enough to sort of believe in God. So it was a bit of a case of the pagans were looked down upon, which is why they're saying it's so terrible that they've been attacked by a pagan race. And that the pagans have stole everything from their church, which obviously to the Christians was so important. Another thing, it says, so Alcuin was a scholar. That means he was a learned person, and he was a monk living in Germany who heard the news of a devastating Viking raid in the monastery of Lindisfarne in Northumbria. He heard about it on 8th of June. Now, we know it happened in about January, so it was several months later. He wrote long letters to the Northumbrian king and to the bishop of Lindisfarne, commiserating with their plight and blaming it on the sinful lives of their people. So that's really important. Sinful means living badly or doing bad things. So he was blaming the attack on the fact that the people who lived in Lindisfarne and the people who lived in Northumbria were terrible people and they were making bad choices. And because they were making bad choices, God had sent the Vikings to attack. That's kind of what Alcuin was suggesting in his letters. So I've got another extract for you on this next page, which sort of sums it up a bit more. So he says, consider carefully, brothers, and examine diligently, lest perchance this unaccustomed and unheard of evil was merited by some unheard of evil practice. Consider the dress, the way of wearing the hair, the luxurious habits of princes and people. So again, what we're saying there is, what is he saying in the letter? He's saying how terrible the attack was. So he's basically summarizing what we already know from the first source, and he's saying how terrible it was that they've attacked and stolen from Lindisfarne. Who does he blame for it? He blames the people. He's saying the people must have been doing something wrong. The people in Northumbria must have not been covering their hair correctly, or they must have been dressing in a way that wasn't correct for the times. And something they've done has caused this attack to happen. Now, do you believe that? No, most likely no. It's not a thing, is it? He is blaming that on anything, isn't he? He's saying maybe if you all change what you're doing, maybe if you become better people, then you won't be attacked again. Now, he's sort of thinking that maybe that would make it better. If people were better people, then they'd be less likely to have bad things happen to them. Now, we know through history that lots of bad things happen to lots of good people, and it doesn't really necessarily come down to people's own bad choices. Is he reliable? Well, I would say no. He wasn't there at the time. He's just recounting other words that he's heard. So in terms of the time, it is of the same year. So at least we're getting a letter that's of a similar year. But he wasn't there. He hasn't probably talked to anyone who was there. So his account is just a summary of events. It's confirming what we heard from the other account, but it's not giving us anything different. It's not giving us any more in-depth information. It's not giving us anything that is slightly different to the other one. Okay. Right, this is the last source. Now, this source was written and published in 1100 AD. It's from Historia Regan, which means History of Kings, and it wrote the history of the north of England and Northumberland. There's only one manuscript left of this book, and it's located in Yorkshire. We're going to talk about whether or not it's reliable, why or why not. So another chronicler, and they're working from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is the first thing we looked at, that first source. He writes of this year. In the same year, the pagans from the northern regions came with a naval force to Britain, like stinging hornets, and spread on all sides like fearful wolves, robbed, tore, and slaughtered not only beasts of burden, sheep and oxen, but even priests and deacons and companies of monks and nuns. And they came to the church of Lindisfarne, laid everything waste with grievous plundering, trampled the holy places with polluted steps, dug up the altars, and seized all the treasures of the holy church. They killed some of the brothers, took some away with them in fetters. Many they drove out, naked and loaded with insults. Some they drowned in the sea. So that's his what he's written in Historia Regan, which, like we said, it's the history of kings. Now, is it reliable? What do we think? Well, he must have done some research for his book. So he must have read lots of different accounts. He's working from a lost version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was written at the time, so that's quite reliable. But this is, I mean, if we're talking about it happened in 793, we're talking 1100. We're talking 300 years after this event has happened. So therefore, he's just going off other people's information. He's probably embellishing a little bit as he goes. So his account is not as reliable as the first account. The first account is the most reliable because it was written at the time by someone close to the monastery. These ones are less reliable because it was written so far after. It is based off truths. It is based off the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which means that there must be some evidence there. Okay, so we must have based what he's saying off some of that evidence. So in terms of reliability, it's reliable in terms of the fact that it's used the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is a primary source, to write this information. But it is written 300 years after the fact, and it could be embellishing what has happened. Okay, embellishing means to add to or to change slightly. So in the first one we read from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it didn't mention anything to do with this. It didn't mention the fact that it drove them out and they drowned in the sea. It didn't talk about that in that first one. I'm not saying that I've not got all the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. It says it's from a lost version, so perhaps it's one we don't have currently to have a look at. If you've got time to do more reading, I suggest having a look at it and seeing what you can find out. So what do you notice then about all the sources? Have a think. What have you noticed? Who's written all the sources? Well, if you look carefully, all the sources have been written by Anglo-Saxon people. The first one was written by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The second was written by a Christian that lived in Germany at the time. Germany and in France, he'd sort of moved around quite a bit, but he was from Northumbria. And the third one is written a history of the area. None of these sources have been written by Vikings. None of these sources have a Viking account of events. So the only account we have of these events is an Anglo-Saxon version. Now, that might not be a problem. That might be a problem. You need to decide that. You need to have a think. Is it an issue if we've only got one side of history? Because we know there was an attack there. We know that without a shadow of a doubt. We know that there was an attack. We know that lots of people probably died. We know that they stole things. But we don't know all the events that led up to it. We don't know why there was an attack there. We don't know if anything predated it. So that's one of the things that we have that's a bit of a difficulty. So there are no written accounts from Vikings about the attack. So the information we have is one-sided, could be biased. We don't know for certain. This attack and how it was written impacts on how Vikings were thought of for hundreds of years. So the impact of this raid and the fact that it was so well recorded meant that people thought certain things about Vikings for several years. And that is a problem, isn't it, when you think about it? Because if these accounts aren't quite truthful, might be, but they might not, then people perhaps had negative thoughts about Vikings when they didn't need to have. So it's important to think about that. We have got a little video to summarize. I'm just going to open that up for you now. Okay, this video here is just a little summary of what we've had so far.
Viking raid on Lindisfarne, AD 793. Lindisfarne was a small island off the northeastern coast of England, which was part of the kingdom of the Northumbrian King Oswald. Founded by St. Aidan at the request of King Oswald, this small island near the Scottish border became home to a monastery known today as the Lindisfarne Priory, or the Holy Island. The priory was originally made of wooden walls and a thatched roof. However, in the late 7th century, the timber church was replaced by a later bishop who covered the walls in lead. In the year 793, the Lindisfarne Priory experienced several months of upheaval, beginning with a great famine which left many, including the monks, without food. But more challenging times than just empty stomachs lay ahead. On June 8th of 793, a Viking attack was launched on the Holy Island. The only survivors, a few of those belonging to Lindisfarne Priory. In the early Middle Ages, Viking attacks were increasing in frequency and distance. Due to the design of Viking longships, Vikings were capable of traveling vast distances for exploration and for the opportunity of plunder, using both sails and the power of Viking rowers. The attack on Lindisfarne in 793 came from a Viking settlement in the north, possibly originating in Norway. It was not the first time that raiders had attacked England, but it was this attack on Christian land that may have begun what is now known as the Viking Age. Stories that were told about Viking attacks in Anglo-Saxon England and Scotland recorded instances of brutal torture by Vikings for both punishment and recreation. In the case of the Viking attack on Lindisfarne, Havoc was wrought upon both the island and the monastery. It was chosen by the Norsemen because it was an easy target, wealthy and full of treasures, remote and unarmed. Citizens and monks alike were slaughtered, even taken as slaves, and buildings were destroyed by the Viking raiders. Treasure was plundered, including gold crosses, silver goblets, and a gospel book with a cover decorated in gold and jewels. Luckily, they missed the monk's most important relic, the body and coffin of St. Cuthbert. Viking torture techniques, specifically at Lindisfarne Priory, included tying monks to trees, lashing them, and using them as target practice for archers until they were finally beheaded in what may have actually been an act of mercy, as opposed to spending years as slaves to the Viking raiders. Even if the monks had been able to defend themselves properly, the Vikings were skilled in battle, using shields, swords, spears, battle axes, and bow and arrows. St. Alcuin himself described the attack in a letter to the king and the presiding bishop of the priory. Pagans have desecrated God's sanctuary, shed the blood of saints around the altar, laid waste the house of our hope, and trampled the bodies of saints like dung in the streets. Never before has such an atrocity been seen. It was this attack on Lindisfarne Priory that created terror throughout England and continental Europe, about the brutality of the Viking people and the imminence of their raids. Viking attacks also created terror due to the unpredictability of raids, as the longships were fast and quiet, and they could maneuver easily to many places in Europe. The shallow hull of longships also allowed them to travel upriver with ease, and they could be dragged across land, which spread great fear, as they could attack areas far from the coast. Other attacks had been launched by the Vikings on European and Anglo-Saxon communities, but it was the fact that Lindisfarne was undefended, exposed, and a center of Christian belief and education that further offended and threatened the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy and community. The Viking raids on Anglo-Saxon communities, like Lindisfarne, continued for another 200 years. Viking raids would increase in frequency in Anglo-Saxon England, and they even captured the town of York by 866. The Vikings used their position in England to mount a larger attack on the Kingdom of Northumberland, which subsequently collapsed in 800.
Right, we're gonna leave that little bit there because we don't want to have too many spoilers. So your work today is you have got some questions based on Lindisfarne to look at the reliability of the sources. I've got there's two different things for you to look at. You can look at the sources. I've included a document with all the sources in, and I've also included a document with the questions. So you need to look at both those documents to see what you think and answer the questions. Okay, thank you for everything. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you later.